everybody, and welcome to another episode of Inspiration to Publication. I am Caroline Smith, and this season we're doing things a little bit differently. So, this is season 3 of the Inspiration Publication podcast. And what I've done for this season is we're going to have some guest authors joining us this season. And we've also moved over to YouTube. So maybe you've found this on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform. Either way, I am so happy to have you here. If you're new to the podcast, Inspiration and Publication really talks about a lot of the challenges that authors face getting from inspiration to writing their book all the way through the publication phase, no matter what avenue you decide to pursue in terms of publishing. So really what we want to think about are techniques that we can use to become better writers. I am not only an editor, but also an author coach. So it's really important to me to feel like authors have a way and support through their writing process, because it can be a very lonely journey. I've talked about this on many podcasts before, that writing can be isolating. So if you don't have the ability to hire an author coach or be a part of a writing community or have that kind of accountability, then hopefully this podcast can still set you up with some tips and tricks to help you move through this process pretty easily without feeling like you're getting behind in your writing. And we've got some great topics to cover this season. So I hope you will stick around and join us for all of the things that we're going to be discussing. I've got a couple of really interesting topics to discuss for this season. So we're going to be talking about generative AI in publishing and how that's impacting authors and the publishing industry in general. We're also going to be talking about different paths to publishing. So self-publishing, traditional publishing, hybrid publishing, and maybe dispelling some myths and notions that you may or may not have about those different types of publishing. And that's really what is going to be our main topic today, is self-publishing or independent publishing and pros and cons of that, how to move through it. I've started this podcast so many different times in terms of this topic, and it's really interesting because indie publishing is evolving so much. So now that I've kind of worked through this process with some of my authors that have moved to independent publishing, I understand it a little bit more. And so I wanted to really give you some insight if this is a path of publishing that you're looking at. I have another podcast for people who are interested in querying agents and looking for a traditional publisher. So I invite you to look back at some of my other episodes and see if that's interesting to you in terms of traditional publishing. But our next podcast episode is going to cover traditional publishing in and of itself. I thought about doing this, as indie publishing versus traditional publishing and kind of comparing the two in one podcast episode. But I do like to make my podcasts short for you, so 30 minutes or less, so that it's easily digestible information. And I just didn't feel like I could do it justice in such a condensed time frame. So instead, we're going to split it up into 3 separate podcasts so that you really have a good idea of exactly what it is that each different type of publishing path can bring to you and how it's beneficial to you or how maybe it's not beneficial to you. So you may or may not know that I've been in publishing for about 15 years now, and I have seen so many different versions of publishing, and it's been so fascinating to watch it evolve over the last 15 years. And when I first started in publishing, traditional publishing was the way to go. That's the way everybody wanted to publish. There were certainly some hybrid publishers. And before you wrinkle your nose at the idea of hybrid publishing, just wait to hold, have any real opinion on that until we talk about the hybrid publishing option in our 3rd episode of this season. But I really have seen so many different things happen. When I first started, and I was working at my first publishing company, it was the Big 10 as far as traditional publishers. Now it's down to the Big 5 after mergers and acquisitions have happened, particularly in New York. And interestingly enough, almost every single big publishing company also now has an independent publishing arm associated with them. So again, when I first started, the really the only way to independently publish, or the big way to independently publish, was through CreateSpace, which was owned by the Zon. And the quality just was not very good. The features and the way to upload was just unwieldy. It was just not really a great way to self-publish your book. And like I said, the term self-publishing was kind of dirty, in terms of the fact that nobody really gave it much credibility because a lot of authors didn't have a formatter, they didn't have an editor, and people could just publish whatever they wanted. And in some cases and ways, that's still true. But certainly we've evolved a little bit more in terms of how we view independently published books. And I think that that's for the better. Of course, those numbers grew exponentially during the pandemic, and we saw a lot of people staying at home and spending their time writing. And I think that that has been incredible for reasons that I will enumerate in a separate podcast. But I think that it's just been really, really interesting to watch the evolution of publishing and how all of this is happening. But let's get into self-publishing, or independent publishing as it's more commonly known today, and the pros and cons of self-publishing. One of the things that I want to say early and often throughout this podcast is that if you choose to independently publish, I want you to remember that just like writing, it's a marathon and not a sprint. This is a long-term investment and project. The great thing to remember is that books are evergreen sales. So even if they don't have huge returns in your launch time for independent publishing, this is a book potentially that you can sell for years, unless it's about one particular current event or something along those lines, and you're trying to capitalize on that for your launch. But just remember always that independently publishing is an evergreen type sale. And I've talked about this in many of my podcasts, but you always want to view your book as a business. And we're going to talk about lots of different ways to do that. I have a podcast on the financial dynamics of publishing. I would encourage you to go listen to that, because I'm not really going to break down the financial aspect of self-publishing as much in this episode. I'll touch on it a little bit, but that's not going to be the crux of this particular podcast. We just want to know and understand what independent publishing is. What does that mean for you as a writer slash author? That's really what we want to get at. The first topic to consider when we're thinking about independent publishing is, so you have your manuscript finished. What are the next steps that need to happen after that? First, you need an editor, and to be able to make adjustments to your book. I have another podcast on self-editing, so make sure you go listen to that if you have the opportunity to. A lot of tips and techniques for the self-editing process. You need an editor. Then you're going to need alpha and or beta readers. Then you're going to need formatting, interior formatting and design, and also a cover design. So for the purposes of this podcast, we're going to assume that you have done all of those things or are thinking about all of those things. We can cover those topics more specifically in a different podcast. But for now, we just want to lay out and understand the pros and cons of self-publishing. So the first aspect is that you do have creative control. And this lends itself well not only to the editorial process, but also to the interior design process and the cover design process. So you ultimately have final say on the edits that you're going to accept. You have complete creative control over the entire project. You decide what the cover looks like, you decide what the interior formatting looks like and how that's conceived and what your reader is going to see with that. This could be a little bit different for ebooks versus print books or hardcovers. But certainly you get the ultimate say in the design, the overall design of the book. One thing that I'll say that can be a negative aspect of this, if it's your very first time publishing, or you're not really familiar with other books in your genre, and I'm a huge proponent of always reading books in your genre, you may not necessarily know best practices for what to expect in your trope or your genre, or even what the publishing industry standards are. So it can be tricky to kind of walk this path alone if you're doing independent publishing. There are lots of different articles online that can tell you best practices. Ultimately, it is your decision, but your decision for what your cover looks like may not be within the genre standards or the trope standards. And you might think it looks fantastic, and your readers are like, oh, same thing with the interior design and formatting. So it's a great to have your own ideas, but definitely make sure that your ideas are slightly conforming to your genre and what your readers have come to expect. A really good way to do this and kind of get some feedback, well, beta readers certainly are one way. But another way would be to go on Amazon and see what books are performing best in your genre, and or go to the bookstore and find books in your genre and see what looks like it's selling well, what's catching the eye, what fonts are being used. Really, I've heard a lot of indie authors say that it's their book, it's their final decision. They're not going to go with anything that's kind of conventional, but that also could mean that your book's not going to sell. So certainly in considering all of these different ideas for your cover, your font choices, how the interior is laid out, it's okay to be niche, but we also do want to keep in mind always marketability and saleability and readability. You don't want your font to be, 8 point. You don't want it to be large print and like 25 point necessarily, unless you're doing only large print. So there's a lot of different things to keep in mind, but there is something to be said about conventionality and keeping things in line. There's certainly something to be said about being unique and creating kind of a cult classic and following for your readers. But I think that there is a way to find balance and stay in the middle with those things. So certainly get feedback. At our publishing company, we used to do we would get 4 or 5 different designs for a cover, and we would put them on a social media platform and ask people for feedback on what they resonated with the most. I think that's a great way to, it kind of limits your ability to do a quote unquote cover reveal, but at least it does put your book in front of people, and you get readers, your potential readers, helping you make a decision about what that cover design looks like. And that can be really fun too. So the first pro, just to recap, would be creative control. The second pro that I want to talk to you about is royalties. We'll talk more specifically about this in the traditional publishing podcast episode, but typical royalties for traditional publishing companies, or trad pubs, as they've come to be known, is between 2 and 14%. You do have the ability to have much higher royalties in online distribution as an indie publisher. We'll talk about different indie platforms for you to consider in publishing, but you can expect to get anywhere between 40 and 70% of your royalty with online distribution. You're never going to get 100% royalties unless you're only selling in person. And even then, you have to subtract the cost of printing and shipping your book to yourself. So definitely something to keep in mind. Higher royalties are fantastic. There are a lot of different online platforms that we'll talk about, or publishing platforms, to help you with distribution. Some of those are going to require different royalty amounts, but this is one of the big reasons why people choose to independently publish, because when you say 2 to 14% for trad pub royalties, that's really not a lot. But you also have to remember that the trad pub has to keep the lights on and employ people. And so it's a lot easier for indie publishers when you don't have as much upfront cost, and you can, get a lot of money back yourself. That's a big reason why people have sometimes moved from traditional publishing to indie publishing, because of that higher royalty rate that they want to see. Another consideration for indie publishing is that the time to market, from the time that you have your book finished and the time to get it published, is much faster, historically speaking, in indie publishing. With indie publishing, really the timeline is you finishing your book and getting it written, how long the cover design takes, how long the editing and interior design takes. Once you have those final files on every publishing platform that I'm aware of, you can have your book to market within 48 to 72 hours. So that's very, very fast. So you can do pre-orders if you want to and set that up for, a year down the line. Used to be on Amazon that you couldn't do pre-orders. It had to be within 90 days that you had to be able to fulfill that, but that's no longer the case. You can now on KDP set up your pre-order for a year in advance. And the same is true with IngramSpark and a couple of the other indie publishing platforms. So typically, let's just talk about this typically. If we're talking about an editorial process from the time your manuscript is finished, because your book could take you anywhere from 15 years to 5 months to write. So let's just talk about your manuscript is finished. You've gotten through all of your self edits. You've sent it to an editor. The editorial turnaround time typically is 6 weeks for that first round of edits, depending on book length. If we're, talking about 20,000 words, it could be shorter. If we're talking about 210,000 words, it could be longer. That's going to be dependent on your editor and their editorial calendar. But let's just say for that first round, about 6 weeks on average. And then you'll go back and forth a few times, making sure those edits are in alignment. So let's just average about 3 months for your edits to be completely done after a few iterations of edits. After that, cover design, probably anywhere around 14 days after you're going back and forth with the cover designer, depending on the designer or company that you're using. Interior design, about the same length of time, about 14 days, could be a little longer depending on the book length. If you have a children's book, this doesn't necessarily apply to you because you'll have to get illustrations done, and that can take up to 18 months. So obviously there's variations in this. I just want to give you a general idea of timeline. So interior design can also be happening at the same time that cover design is happening. So if that's the case and you're not having to stagger them, then around 2 weeks for those to be complete. So now we're at, let's just give ourselves a little bit of extra time, 4 months from the time you finish your manuscript to having the edits complete, interior design done, and cover done. Typically, when we found delays in this process with our authors, it was because they did not respond to us necessarily in a timely fashion, getting us feedback for their cover or edits or interior design. So certainly some of this timeline hinges on you as well as the vendors that you're working with. So certainly keep that in mind. If you have a really tight deadline and schedule, I would say always add at least a month of additional time just to make changes. Another reason for that is you're going to want to get a proof done. No matter what way you decide to publish, you always need to get a proof done. The proof is the physical copy of the book. Once the interior design has been done, the cover is done, all of the edits are complete. You would then upload that to your online distribution partner, get a proof. Sometimes that can take anywhere from 5 to 10 days just to get that. And then you see it and you might want to make changes. Then you have to go back to your cover designer or your interior designer or your editor, or whatever the case may be. So without those people there, it's necessarily faster, right? If you're the one who's doing all of these things. However, the problem is that you may not know how to do all of these things. You may just need to get the final files. So make sure that you're building in time for all of these different steps for changes throughout the process to get a proof. Give yourself time to make changes to that proof, and always give yourself more time than you think you're going to need. However, once those final files are complete, you've made all of the changes in your proof, you can approve on most websites pretty instantly. On IngramSpark, I know it takes 2 days. Amazon takes 72 hours. And then on Ingram, you approve, and then pretty quickly it's available. Usually I've seen on Ingram that it's available about 14 days-ish on all of the online distribution platforms. But you still set the date of when you want the book to launch, and it can go forward as planned. Hopefully you've made all of your changes and caught all of the edits that may need to have happened in the proof stage as well by that time. There's other things we can talk about in terms of the proof and making sure that you have the final file uploaded. But certainly make sure you have the final file uploaded before your launch date if this is a path that you choose to take, because they will send out the uncorrected version if you're still making changes, and that will be what's available on all of your online platforms. But getting back to the topic at hand, the time to market is much faster than in traditional publishing, where you may spend years looking for an agent, who's then going to have to look for a publisher, and then it'll go in the pipeline of the publisher, and they take, as long as they want to get the cover design, edits, interior, things like that. So it could be, depending on the publishing company, anywhere from a year to 5 years to get that done. But that's including querying agents and getting picked up by an agent and a publisher. So much more of a broad timeline in terms of traditional publishing. So that way you don't have to go through those traditional publishing channels. Another thing to consider with independent publishing is rights, owning the rights to your book. So let's say hypothetically that you write a book and it's amazing and you publish it and some film company wants to pick it up. If you're traditionally published, you have to negotiate those film rights through either your agent or the publishing company and make all of those decisions that way. If you're self-published, you don't have to do that. All of that ownership goes through you. And it's everybody says, so many authors that I've spoken to throughout the years are convinced that their book is going to be a next great film. And some of them have been turned into films. Some books that I've worked on over the years have absolutely been turned into films, whether they're small independent films or something a little bit bigger. That's the ultimate goal. We want to see our characters come to life on screen in the same way that they do in our head. But you retain all of the rights to your work. So if someone decides they want to translate it, they have to go through you to do that. If you decide you want to translate it into another language, you can, and you can have it available in as many platforms and as many ways as you want it. There are some strange rights when we're talking about online distribution systems that you do have to adhere to and be mindful of, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But really, you basically have ultimate control. Again, you have creative control, and then you have ownership of your rights. And so you're not selling the rights to your book for anyone, which is what you're doing in a traditional publishing setting. You can also then choose to move into audiobook if you want to, or any other type of format as well. You could also shop it out to different filmmakers or production companies yourself if that was a path you wanted to take. The other really nice thing about independent publishing is that you do have the opportunity to have a direct connection with your readers. So you can then engage with them through social media, you can build a following, and you can receive pretty immediate feedback. We're going to do another podcast this episode on alpha readers, beta readers, and advanced reading copies, or ARCs, because there's a lot to talk about as far as that's concerned. But the nice thing about this is that unless you're going through an assistant, which you may choose to hire a virtual assistant if you do indie publish, it would make life a lot easier. Then you can still interact directly with your readers. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's a bad thing. So many people have said, don't read the comments. And so that can be true with reviews as well. If you're doing an ARC through something like Booksprout or BookBub or Goodreads, and you can see exactly what your readers are saying. Not that you're shielded from that necessarily if you traditionally publish, but there is a kind of a gatekeeper there, if you will. And with self-publishing, that's not as true, again, depending on the publisher that you're looking at. Let's move a little bit into some of the cons. I've mentioned a couple of things as we've been talking about some of these pros too. But the biggest thing to consider with traditional publishing is that you're not having to pay necessarily to have your book published. In self-publishing or independent publishing, you are incurring all of those costs. For the most part, independent publishing is free to get your book out into the world. The cost of publishing is practically nothing. On every platform that I'm aware of, you don't actually have to pay for publishing. So I'm thinking of Draft to Digital, IngramSpark, Amazon KDP. Those are all free to put your book on that platform. So there's no real financial barrier. Now, that's not including the cost of editing, the cost of the interior design, the cost of the cover design. But to get the book uploaded on all of these different platforms is no cost to you. There may be others that do have a cost associated with them. But those are the three main ones that I can think of, and there's no cost associated with putting your book out into the world. That is separate from a marketing cost and paying for marketing through Amazon ads, Facebook ads, you know, advanced reading copies through BookBub or Booksprout. You know, there is going to be a little bit of a cost incurred with all of those. And again, we'll dedicate another podcast to the ARCs and that line of getting books out there. But overall, there's no cost to actual publishing. However, again, with the cost you're looking at, and we've talked again about the financial dynamics of publishing in a separate episode, so go listen to that one. But you could publish anywhere in independent publishing. The cost to get you to those final files could be anywhere from $500 to $5,000, depending on your cover design and your editor and your interior design as well. So all of that should play a role in this. And you should absolutely be keeping track of your expenses for your publishing journey, no matter what way you're doing that, whether it's self or traditional publishing. Alongside of those financial aspects to consider in terms of that upfront cost for indie publishing are going to be things like marketing and distribution. You are going to have to be responsible for the cost of your marketing and distribution. The beautiful thing about a company like IngramSpark is that they are online to 39,000 different online distribution platforms. So your book is getting out there. You still have to market it though. I see so many people who just put their book online in whatever capacity, no matter who the platform is, and they think it's just going to sell itself because now it's there. But when we consider the fact that something like 2 million books alone are published in the US every year, it's a lot. That's a lot of competition. So no, unless you're doing Amazon ads and you're getting sponsored ads, they're not going to be seen on the platform necessarily. You have to tell people about your book and about what's happening. And in order to do that, you typically have to pay for those services, whether it's influencers or those advanced reading copies like I was talking about. And that can be a little bit challenging to get that marketing done and know what the right thing is to do. I often say I've been working, kind of sideways in marketing since I was 14. I was the marketing director for a music company in Atlanta when I was younger. And really, the whole thing about marketing is just throwing something at the wall and seeing what sticks. There's no right answer. And what you've done last year could be completely different than what you do next year because what you've been doing for 6 months is just suddenly not working anymore. And that's kind of the name of the game. And it's really interesting when we think about people who want to independently publish. Just doing the marketing for your own book could be a full-time job if you wanted it to be. So it really does depend on how much time, effort, and money you want to put into your own independent publishing. And like I said, thinking about it as a business really does help because even if you have a full-time job, how much time would you dedicate to a side hustle? Or if you wanted to open your own business, how much time and money would you dedicate to that? And that's essentially the same thing you need to consider when you're doing a book, independently publishing a book. It is a business. That's why publishing companies exist, because it's a business. So don't lose sight of that fact. Some people it works really well for. You can do a lot of social media marketing. You just get the right, the sweet spot of your audience and the book and your genre and all of the different things. And away it goes. And you're suddenly a, best-selling author. And of course, that's what we all hope for. For others of us, it takes some time. I've talked about this as well, that like I said, it's a marathon, not a sprint. But if you do want to be successful as a writer and an author, it's a really good idea to have multiple books. Very rarely are you going to have a huge amount of fame with just one. There are definitely some outliers. Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian, is one of my favorite examples of this. And then, of course, it got turned into a movie with Matt Damon, but he independently published and it just completely took off. There are some other people who independently published. The Twilight series was independently published, and then a huge publishing company took it over and published all of the books all at the same time and put them out to market. And there are others as well. Certainly the list is long for those, but those are not the typical case once we're talking about independent publishing. Those do tend to be the outliers. And again, if we're talking about, let's just say 2 books a year that are picked up by a traditional publishing company that have been independently published, out of the 2 million that are being published every year, that's not a huge number. So think about that as well. Again, not to try to dissuade you from independent publishing, but I certainly want you to have all of the information as you're going through this process. There is one case that I can think of where you may not want to independently publish, and that could be if there's going to be any kind of lack of professional validation in your publishing journey. Mostly, this is where I can think of academic writers who might want to go with an academic press, or a subject matter expert in your field. So this is mostly to do with nonfiction. Sometimes in academia, independently publishing is still looked down on in terms of lack of credibility, and maybe people thinking that there's lower quality, even if that's not necessarily the case. So this is an area where you kind of have to understand your reader, who your audience is. If you're publishing toward other academicians, they may kind of go, I don't want to pick that up because it's self-published. That may not be true. You really just have to, again, know your audience and understand that in some cases, not just in academia, but in other areas as well, it may be something that is still looked down on. Because again, it was kind of this dirty word for a while because it didn't self-publishing was not associated with validity and credibility 10 or 15 years ago. And unfortunately, some people do still have that mindset. And it can be true. The other aspect to consider with independent publishing is going to be limited access to being on the shelf in a bookstore, a physical bookstore. And I'm not talking about independent bookstores. If you're thinking about the bigger distribution channels for independent publishing and like a Barnes and Noble, then they go through a big company called Baker and Taylor, and you have to have a certain amount of books published per year to even be in Baker and Taylor. And that pretty much assures that you're going to be on the shelf at a store like Barnes and Noble or any of the other big bookstores. Now, what is true of independent publishing is pretty much if you're listed with Ingram, then any bookstore can find your book and is probably willing to order it as long as they know that it's there and put it on their shelf. Now, there's different ways that this usually happens. Sometimes I have heard some of my authors tell me that recently Barnes and Noble is not doing this anymore because they now have their own independent publishing arm. It used to be the case that you could go to Barnes and Noble, tell them that you had a book published through Ingram, and ask if they would carry it in the local authors section, and maybe you could come in and do a book signing. It sounds like in some cases, for some Barnes and Nobles, depending on the region that it's in, that may or may not be true anymore. So you really just have to hit the ground running and talk to these booksellers. And if independent booksellers are generally always willing to support independent authors. So certainly just go talk to somebody, call the store, ask them if they would carry your book. And again, as long as it's listed in Ingram, then they're usually happy to do that. If you're on Amazon KDP, or Kindle Unlimited or Kindle Select, usually Amazon says that for the first 90 days, you have to sell exclusively with them. And also independent bookstores don't have access to the Amazon library. So you're much less likely to be carried in a physical bookstore if your book is only on the Amazon platform. They really want to drive those online sales, obviously, and then they're losing out on a royalty, of course. So it's much harder if you're an Amazon exclusive author to be listed in a physical bookstore. And it can be hard as an independent author, even if you're listed on Ingram, to be carried in a big box bookstore. So you really just kind of have to talk to people, make relationships, make friends, network, and figure out what the right path is for you. There are some independent bookstores that will carry your book on consignment, and that means that you have to print copies of your book and take it to the store. Let's just say 5 or 10 copies, and then they pay you the royalty on those books once they've actually sold them. So you're not getting money right up front when they order those books, but after those sales have happened. But at least you're on a bookshelf. So that can be really nice too. And then you can do some in-person signings or a book talk or something like that. Again, the other pro or con, excuse me, that we've already kind of covered is the time commitment for independent publishing. So not only writing the manuscript, but then looking at waiting for edits, waiting for the interior to be finished, and the marketing. So this is one of those things where you really have to look at the cost benefit ratio for you. If you have a life right now that's full of children that you're raising and a job that you're working and other commitments that you have, then maybe independent publishing is not right for you at this moment. That doesn't mean it won't be right for you in the future, but there is a lot of time that needs to be dedicated to independent publishing and marketing, especially. Again, going door to door to booksellers and asking if they'll carry your book, doing book signings, going and doing talks or podcast interviews, spending a lot of your time on social media, creating posts, spending a lot of your time on the ARC bookseller sites or the ARCs, and getting people to read your book and putting it in front of influencers and putting it in front of other authors and going to book conferences or book fairs. There is a significant time investment involved. And again, your book is your business. So however much time you would dedicate to your business, if you had one, or a side hustle, how much time would you be willing to spend in dedication to your book as well? Definitely a big important factor to consider. I have seen a lot of authors with amazing books over the years who just published their book and ended up not, life happens, right? Ended up not having any time to focus on marketing their book. And it was to their detriment, unfortunately. Now, again, books are evergreen sales. So even if they didn't have time to dedicate to it right after the launch, maybe a few years later they were able to pick it up. Maybe they weren't. It just depends, right? Everything in publishing depends. I've said that so many times in so many different podcast episodes. It just depends on so many different factors. And the only person who really knows what those factors are going to be and what you're capable of is you. So I hope that I'm not, again, talking you out of independent publishing, but these are definitely things you need to consider when you want to have a successful book. If your only goal is to have a book in print and say, hey, I have this book now, then you don't really need to do anything else. You've written it, you've gotten it designed, you've gotten the cover done, everything is hunky-dory, you can move on with your life, you have no other goals, you don't want to make money, you don't care if people see it. That's great. Go along with that. If you want more notoriety than that, then certainly there are a lot of different steps to take in terms of marketing. And we'll talk about marketing in a separate podcast. And we've talked about it a little bit in previous podcasts. So again, be sure to go check those out. One other thing that I want to touch on, and then we're just about done with this episode. So thanks for your patience. I've mentioned a couple of online indie platforms that you can take a look at. So I'm going to tell you my favorite ones and the differences between some of those. There are so many out there, but these are my favorites and the way that I like to think about doing distribution through these different platforms. So Amazon KDP and Kindle Select for ebooks in particular is really great. You can design your own cover. They'll help you with the interior on there. If you do Kindle Select, then you do give your book to Amazon exclusively for 90 days, and that's more limited distribution. And then after those 90 days, you can opt out and then choose to go wide if you want to, is what we call it in the industry, where you can then be on other online platforms or go do distribution in person or things along those lines. But that 90 days is important, so keep that in mind. But again, Amazon KDP will help with all aspects of your book. So they can help you with that interior design. There's a great new software that they have. So you upload your book and then you can do all of the interior design yourself. It's called Kindle Create. And it will, once you're finished doing the interior, it will help you or ask you if you want to finish the file as an EPUB or as a KPF file, and the KPF file is the Kindle only file. So certainly a really good avenue there if you want kind of a one-stop shop. The other one-stop shop would be IngramSpark. They also have a book building tool. Again, it's free to publish. You can get a free ISBN on both Amazon KDP and IngramSpark. The nice thing about IngramSpark, I find their customer service to be better. Personally, my experiences with their customer service have been good. I know that that is a complaint that some people have. Um, but I love their book building tool. You have the cover, you can do the interior, you can do an ebook, hardcover, and paperback on IngramSpark. On Amazon, I believe you can only do an ebook and a paperback, and you have to do the hardcover somewhere else because they don't have hardcover capabilities. So the formats are different on each of them, so it really depends on what you want to do there. IngramSpark also, you are on, like I mentioned, 39,000 different online platforms, so you have the ability to have that wide distribution, global distribution through them. They also have a really neat marketing tool where you can market through them and be put in different library catalogs. So that's pretty cool too. Of course, you can do Amazon ads with Amazon KDP. The other one to consider would be Draft 2, the number 2 digital. And on there, you can do ebook, audiobook, print book, and hardcover, I believe. You can get an ISBN. The really nice thing about Draft to Digital is that when you upload your file, it then goes, can select where you want it to go. So you can choose for ebooks, especially Kobo, Apple Books, Smashwords, Barnes and Noble, Amazon. The list is long and endless, and they're constantly adding new ones all the time. So I really like Draft to Digital because it really does get your ebook in a lot of different ebook platforms that you may have not even considered before. Kindle is not the only one that exists, especially for people that are international. If you want international distribution, Kobo, Rakuten, Apple Books, those all have really good international distribution as far as ebooks are concerned in English. You could also translate your book into another language if you were so inclined. But those are the ones that are really my favorites to work with. I've done for myself and for other authors, I've done ebooks on Draft to Digital. I've done paperbacks through IngramSpark. You can put them in any combination of places unless you have the 90-day exclusive window with Amazon. But a lot of people do Amazon for those first 90 days and then do a print book with IngramSpark or put their audiobook on Draft to Digital. So you really just have to find what works best for you. You could just use one platform. I know a lot of authors who only use Amazon and nothing else. They want that exclusive distribution. I know a lot of people who want global distribution, and so they only want to use IngramSpark. So you have to just find what works best for you, and it can be overwhelming, but you really do need to do your research and your due diligence, just as if you were starting your own business. Barnes and Noble also has their own independent publishing arm now, as I mentioned. A lot of the big traditional publishing companies do. I think HarperCollins, Simon & Schuster, Penguin, and Random House all have their own independent publishing arm. You have to be approved to publish through them, but that's certainly an avenue that you could consider as well. And then we have BookBaby and Wattpad. I also wanted to mention Lulu. If you put on, Lulu is a separate company, but if you are on Draft to Digital, you can put it on Lulu and Smashwords as well. And so you get additional distribution through those platforms too. So I hope this has been helpful. I know it's a lot of information to think about. It can be very overwhelming. The idea is just that you know that all of these different avenues exist, and then you can choose what's best for you. If it were me and it was my debut novel and I didn't really know what I was doing, I would hire an editor and then I would get on an account through IngramSpark and I would use their book building tool and I would go that direction and have global distribution right off the bat and not limit yourself necessarily. Then once you start building a catalog of books or a series or something like that, you can then look at all of these other platforms and see what works best for you. That would be my just starting out advice. And you may not necessarily agree with that. You may have a different path that you want to take for a myriad of reasons, but that would be my recommendation. And also, all of these online platforms have great resources that you can look at. So even if you don't choose to use IngramSpark, I'm not getting paid by any of these companies, by the way. Even if you choose not to use IngramSpark, there are still amazing resources on their blog and on their website. Amazon as well. There's so many different resources on there and Draft to Digital to kind of help guide you through the process so that you're not feeling so alone. And of course, if you need help, I can be a resource too. Just let me know. So I hope that you can digest some of this information on independent publishing. Our next episode is going to be on traditional publishing and why that might be a path some people want to take instead to compare and contrast the two. So we'll dive deep into that traditional publishing space, and then we'll talk about hybrid publishing and why that might be the right answer for some people. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you're looking forward to the next episode. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.